Just before I start, I don't know whether anybody has seen this analysis of the structure of the prophecy of Isaiah and the likeness to the structure of the scriptures. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah, divided into the Old Testament 39 chapters, the New Testament 27 chapters, whereas the prophecy of Isaiah has 66 chapters. There are 39 chapters up to the end of that historic section, and then we're looking now at the second part of Isaiah, in which there are 27 chapters. Interesting comparison there. And that analysis looks at the way Assyria is dealt with in the first part and Babylon in the second. And we shall be looking at, well, I take chapter 40 as my analysis of chapter 40 is that verses 1 to 11 are comfort ye my people. Verses 12 to 17, Yahweh's power to save. Then verses 18 to 20, the folly of idolatry. And this starts a theme that will be elaborated more as you go through the following chapters in Isaiah. The verses 21 to 25, the incomparable power of God. And then verses 26 to 31, I've called his power to sustain. So verses 18 to 20, you've looked already at the comforting of Israel and the greatness of God's power to save. In verses 18 to 20, we have the folly of idolatry. The general word for image in the scriptures is the word selem. It's used in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Let us make man in our image and after our likeness. And if we go to Genesis 9 and verse 6, we see there, I think, the reason why images were not to be used, were condemned. Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6 says, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Why? For in the image of God made he man. And it seems to me that the only acceptable image of God is a living image. And somebody who sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, because he is destroying the living image of God. And that's how we should be. And so God is able to sustain, but man is not to make images. In Isaiah chapter 40 then, and verse 18, to whom then will ye liken God? After our image and after our likeness, the likeness and liken God is the statement of how can you liken God? Man is supposed to develop the likeness of God. When Paul, in the letter to the Corinthians, alludes to Genesis chapter 1, he says that man was made in the image and glory of God. It was intended that man should develop God's glory. And how poor is that likeness that man generally develops to God. But to whom can ye liken? What likeness will ye compare unto him? To compare is to put in order and decide, which is the best. That's the idea of putting what set of creatures, beings, whatever it is, can you put God? You can't put God in any set of powers. There is no comparison with God. To what likeness will ye compare unto him? And then the feeble efforts of man. Verse 19, the workman melteth a graven image, and the goldsmith spreadeth it over with gold and casteth silver chains. He that is so impoverished that he have no oblation chooseth a tree that will not rot. He seeketh unto him a cunning workman to prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. The puny efforts of man. The workman, it's the normal word for a workman. He works and he gets tired. He melteth a graven image. The word for graven image is a carved image. We first read of it in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4. That's interesting. We haven't heard of it before, but in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 Commandments, it's there that we first come across the graven image being mentioned. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth, and so on. That's the first time we read of it. So God knew that they would, and they were forbidden to do so. In Leviticus chapter 26, we have a restatement of the fundamental commandments of God, before going into a chapter that outlines the history of Israel and the punishments that they would receive because of their disobedience. Verse 1 of Leviticus 26, ye shall make you no idols nor graven image, neither rear you up a standing image, neither shall you set up any image of stone in your land to bow down unto it. For I am Yahweh, your God. Ye shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am Yahweh. And the first part deals, Leviticus 20, with the commandments, the blessings, if they would be obedient. And then the second part, which is a much longer section, deals with the punishments that would come upon them if they were disobedient. Within the prophecy of Isaiah, the graven image comes in from now, verse 19 it's mentioned, verse 20 of Isaiah 40. It's mentioned 4 times in chapter 44, another time in chapter 45, and another time in chapter 48. You can see we're starting a section that's concentrating on idolatry, because Babylon was the very embodiment of idolatry. One of the great things that God did by sending Israel into Babylon was to make them so sick of idolatry that they would never bow down to other gods anymore. They came back, and that was not their fault. After they came back, they didn't descend to idolatry afterwards. It's one of those things. So sickened were they of their experience of idolatry in Babylon. Well, here we are. We're starting to deal with a section on Babylon, and here is idolatry coming in. So there were other types of images. There was a molten image. One that is, the word molten means to be poured out. And the first time we read of that is in Exodus chapter 32. A molten image, a molten calf that was made by Aaron. and they bowed down to it. These are thy gods. One of the condemnation of Jeroboam the first in 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 9 is 1 Kings 14 verse 9 says, "But thou hast done evil above all that were before thee, for thou hast gone and made thee other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger, and hast gassed me behind thy back." He'd been told that he would have the kingdom. God sent a prophet to tell him that he would have the northern kingdom of Israel. But he made the molten calves for the people of his kingdom to worship. In Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 22, we read there, "Ye shall defile also the covering of any graven." Here's talking about the situation in the kingdom. It says in verse 21, "Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand and when ye turn to the left. Ye shall defile also the covering of thy graven images of silver, and the ornament of thy molten images of gold. Thou shalt cast them away as a menstruous cloth. Thou shalt say to it, Get thee hence. Thou throw it all away." So their worshipping of images was going to be temporary. So the workman melteth a graven image in verse 19 of Isaiah 40. And it says, "And the goldsmith spreadeth it over with gold." The goldsmith is the Hebrew word saraf, and that's also related to burning. It's used in Judges 7 and verse 4 when God says to Gideon, when his army of 32,000, "Anybody frightened, go off home." And 22,000 went off home. And God says, "No, there's still the 10,000 that are left, there's still too many. Bring me down to the water and we'll try them there." And eventually there were only 300 that were used in the defeat of their enemies on that occasion. And the word try is the same as this word goldsmith. It's it's to try by refining. The idea of refining, and you see the connection then between a goldsmith and trying. He spreadeth it over with gold. In Exodus 39, the word is to beat. And what happened in Exodus 39, in the making of the tabernacle, gold was beaten out very thin, and then it was cut into wires. The idea of beating out very thin is the same as the spreading it over with gold. So it's made very thin, and then you've got a golden veneer upon this image that is being made. So we see it's all the work of men. Verse 20, "He that is so impoverished that he hath no oblation." Again, an oblation. We read of that in Exodus chapter 25. Just look at the context of Exodus 25 and see how that which should be used in the service of God was being used to create false worship. Exodus chapter 25 and verse 2. "Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring me an offering," or an oblation. "Of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart, he shall take my offering. And this is the offering we shall take of them, gold and silver and brass and various other materials that were going to be used in the tabernacle. He that is so impoverished that he has no oblation, it says in Isaiah 40. There's nothing precious that they can use to bow down and worship. And so he chooses the tree, Isaiah 40 and verse 20. He chooses the tree that will not rot. He seeketh unto him a cunning workman to prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. A cunning workman. The word cunning means wise. It's used of the man that Pharaoh called when he had his dream. He called the wise men of Egypt to tell him what the dream meant. And of course there's no one so discreet and wise as Joseph, as that chapter continues. Somebody that's wise, a wise workman. And of course this is wise in a corrupt sense. God expects us to be wise in a true spiritual sense. All the time there is this comparison between what is right and what is wrong. And the condemnation is the way that the children of Israel used these things to develop idolatry. To prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. It shall not be moved. There's a lovely comparison if we go to First Chronicles chapter 16. That chapter that deals with the worship around the tabernacle of David when the ark was brought into Zion, and the Asaph was given the work of developing a system of worship to thank the Lord into the hand of Asaph and his brethren. And there's a psalm that goes on through that chapter. And in verse 30 it says, "Fear before him all the earth, the world also shall be stable, that it be not moved." Just think of the vastness of the world and God's control of the world. I get a tree that will not rot. And you've got a cunning workman, somebody who's able to make something pretty for them that shall not be moved. The puny efforts of man compared with the greatness of God. So the point has been made of the folly of idolatry. And so now we come on to this next section, which deals with the incomparable power of God. Verse 21 of Isaiah 40. "Have ye not known? Have ye not heard? Hath it not been told you from the beginning? Have ye not understood from the foundations of the earth?" The information is out. The ability to understand is there. God has given man that ability. Don't you know the greatness of our God? From the foundations of the earth. Psalm 18 and verse 7. Again, a comparison between the greatness of God. Psalm 18 and verse 7. "Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wrath." God is able to shake the earth. Man is so puny in comparison. And then another passage that gives comfort. Jeremiah chapter 31. You'll perhaps remember that Jeremiah 31 is where we get the new covenant mentioned, and the greatness of the blessings of the people of God if they will be obedient to him. And then in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 37 we read, thus saith Yahweh, the one that's delivered them from that was the name that was revealed in the deliverance from the land of Egypt. Thus saith Yahweh, if heaven can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, saith Yahweh. God still regards the people of Israel as his people. Yes, he will correct them and is continuing to correct them. But they will be brought back. He's not going to forsake them. And brothers and sisters, if we put our trust in him, he will not forsake us either. So then we come back to that state. So he is the one that is there. It is he, verse 22, it is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth. It can either be circle of the earth, the physical earth, or the circuit of the earth, the movement of the earth around the sun. It's he that is in control of these things. They didn't know in earlier days that the earth was round. They thought it was flat. But here you've got in the Bible, in, 700 years before Christ, he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, the physical understanding that God imparts to his people. And he says, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers. Now that's got a lovely connection. When the children of Israel went to spy out the land, Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33. Just look how there's wonderful comparisons, I think, in this chapter between the power of God and the dependability of God, and the fact that he will bless them if only we will put our trust in him, and the puny nature of man. Numbers 13 and verse 33. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. No consideration of the greatness of the power of God that had been used to deliver them from the land of Egypt only a short time before. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. And so the inhabitants of the earth are as grasshoppers. We read in Isaiah chapter 40. It's wonderful how God speaks of these things and how these comparisons come out of the scriptures. The inhabitants of the earth are as grasshoppers, it says, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain. The physical fact that the heavens are expanding has only comparatively recently been understood by astronomers. But here it is in the Bible, 700 years before Christ, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain. And it's an expression that's used several times in the scriptures. It's there in chapter 42 and verse 5, 44 verse 24, 45 it's a recurring theme through these chapters. Chapter 45 and verse 12 is a chapter that deals with the power of God and the fact that he is the great creator and he has stretched out the heavens. And then it says, he stretcheth out the heavens. In Isaiah chapter 5, we have the start of a series of statements regarding God's hand being at work. Chapter 5 of Isaiah and verse 25. Therefore is the anger of Yahweh kindled against his people, and he hath stretched forth his hand against them, and hath smitten them, and the hills did tremble, and their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. For all this, that part of punishment, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. And that becomes a refrain through the following chapters. Until chapter 12, we have an end of the judgments. And verse 1 of chapter 12 says, I will praise thee, though thou wast angry with me, thine anger is turned away, and thou comfortest me. So that God stretches out his hand to punish. He stretches out the heavens. He has the power and is able to deal with us as his children. He'll punish us, but he'll bring us back if only we will put our trust in him. He spreadeth the heavens out as a tent to dwell in. He bringeth the princes, verse 23, as nothing. He maketh the judges of the earth as vanity. The great powers of the earth are nothing compared with this God. The judges of the earth as vanity. That goes right back to Genesis chapter 1, when it says the earth was without form and void. The word for without form is the word translated here, vanity. And the phrase without form and void, incidentally, in a modern Hebrew dictionary that I have, is translated in modern Hebrew as utter chaos. How God brought order out of chaos in the creation. It's interesting that today there's a report of a headmistress that's being castigated for the fact that she believes in the creation record, and the theory of evolution is a theory that hasn't been proved. Plenty of people to go against her on that, but we live in a world where the religion is the theory of evolution. They bow down to the theory of evolution. But they are of no more. The theory of evolution is of no more value than these idols that we're talking about in Isaiah chapter 40. They just get themselves a mindset that takes away their responsibility to God. Because if God is the creator, then they have a responsibility to him. And we do have a responsibility to him, brothers and sisters. So, verse 24 goes on to say, Yea, they shall not be planted, they shall not be sown, their stock shall not take root in the earth. He shall also blow upon them, and they shall wither, and the whirlwind shall take them away as stubble. That's the way God is able to bring people down. They won't be planted, sown, take root. The take root is related to the stock of a tree. In Job we read of the tree that if it's cut down, if it in water, then it'll sprout again. But no, it won't take root. They'll wither. They'll take away. And the whirlwind shall take them away as stubble. And our mind goes back to the record of Elijah, who was taken to heaven, not in a chariot of fire, but in a whirlwind, as it says at the beginning of the chapter. So, yes, it's God that is able to take away like a whirlwind. And they shall be, he shall take them away as stubble. Our minds go back to the children of Israel in Egypt, when they weren't allowed straw, and they gathered stubble instead of straw to make the bricks. But God is able to take away the work of man. Verse 25, to whom then shall ye liken me? Or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One? Back in verse 18 it was, to whom then will ye liken God? Or to what likeness will ye compare unto him? In verse 25 then it says, or shall I be equal? Nothing equals God. In Genesis chapter 14 and verse 17, when Abraham comes back from the slaughter of the kings and meets Melchizedek, it's the king of Sodom that comes to him. It's at Shaveh in the king's dale. And the word Shaveh is related to this word equal. To whom shall ye be equal? And so our minds go to the meeting with, well, we've got the idolater of Sodom, or the way of wickedness of Sodom compared with the great Melchizedek, King of righteousness and King of peace and priest of the Most High God. Who can be equal unto this God, brethren and sisters? And so let us realise his greatness and give him the glory that is due unto him. And then in the end of this last section, verses 26 to 31, we have God's power to sustain. Man is puny, but God can save. In verse 26 then, lift up your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created these things, that bringeth out their host by number. It's quite interesting that the first time that we read about the host is the first verse of Genesis chapter 2. Speaking about the creation of the previous chapter, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. The multitude of the acts of creation. That God is able to do instantly things that we can't understand. Lift up your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created these things, that bringeth out their host by number. He calleth them all by names, by the greatness of his might, for he is strong in power, not one faileth. The word for might is the word vigour, for vigour. In verse 29 it says, he giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increases strength. God is the one that has the might, the vigour that doesn't fade. What a great God we are dealing with. And not one faileth. Go to chapter 34 and verse 16. We read, seek ye out the book of Yahweh and read, no one of these shall fail. None shall want her mate, For my mouth hath commanded, and his spirit it hath gathered them. Nothing that God has said will happen will fail. God is able to fulfill his promises. His word is sure, and we can put our trust indeed in it. And so verse 27, why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel? Notice Jacob, Israel, and they think that they can hide themselves from God. Why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel? My way is hid from Yahweh, and my judgment is passed over from my God. I can get away with it. What folly, brothers and sisters. Jacob, he was the one who tried to manipulate the circumstances for his own benefit. It was when he knew that he couldn't manipulate things, when he was wrestling with the angel, and it touched his thigh, and he halted on his thigh, and he knew he couldn't do it in his own strength. It was then that his name was changed to Israel. He learned to put his trust in God and not in his own strength. Why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel? The nation which had been developed to put their trust in their God. They thought they could do things wrong, and God wouldn't know about it. Verse 28, hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, Yahweh, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. You just can't understand. You can't penetrate his understanding. He fainteth not, neither is weary. He is the everlasting God. Again, the idea of fainting, there's a contrast here. He fainteth not, verse 28. Verse 29, he giveth power to the faint. Verse 30, even the youths shall faint and be weary. So that you've got man in all his vigour, even in youth. They tend to faint from time to time. They get weary. They get tired. God doesn't. He knows what is happening. He knows all our ways. He doesn't get weary. There is no searching. Neither he fainteth not, neither is weary. And that's one of the theme words of Isaiah. 12 times out of 26 in the Old Testament are in the prophecy of Isaiah, and it's starting really in this section in chapter 40. We got it there in verse 28. Verse 30, the youths shall faint and be weary. Verse 31, they shall run and not be weary. The word means to labour also. You get worn out by labour. And again, it's there 3 times in chapter 43, a couple of times in 47, 41 in 49, 57, 62, 63. It's one of those words that crops up. Just take note, really, to realise that God doesn't get weary, just as man does. And then there is no searching of his understanding. If we go to Romans chapter 11, we have the end of that section. Well, the end of the whole section of doctrine in the letter to the Romans. And he concludes that section with an expression of wonder at the greatness of the purpose of God. It says, verse 30, "For as ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief, even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they also may obtain mercy. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all." What man could have thought of this sort of purpose, to which we have been called, brothers and sisters? Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. And that thought is there from Isaiah 40 and verse 28. His judgments are unsearchable. He is the great creator. He is the one that is able to sustain. And so he goes on to say in verse 30 of Isaiah 40, "Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall." The young men shall utterly fall. In Leviticus 26, it talks about the children of Israel being punished for their waywardness because they wouldn't obey his law. In Leviticus 26 and verse 36, we read, "And upon them that are left alive of you, I will send a faintness in their hearts in the land of their enemies, and the sound of a shaken leaf shall chase them, and they shall flee as fleeing from a sword, and they shall fall when none pursueth, and they shall fall one upon another, as it were before a sword, when none pursueth, and you shall have no power to stand before your enemies." That was going to be the state of Israel because of their disobedience. The young men shall utterly fall, we read in Isaiah chapter 40. Those that seek to go their own way, who are not obedient to the word of God. And then we have a glorious contrast in this last verse of the chapter. "But they that wait upon Yahweh." Gather together. It's used in Genesis chapter 1 of the gathering together of the waters. The gathering together he called seas. But it seems that the waiting upon the Lord is the gathering together to see what he will do in the earth, to have our eyes upon his ways. They that wait upon Yahweh shall renew their strength. The margin for renew says change. That's quite interesting. Genesis chapter 31 and verse 7. See how much of this is rooted right back in Genesis, and how God has shown from the beginning his power and his purpose with the earth. Genesis chapter 31 and verse 7. Jacob talking to his wives and children, he says, "And your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. So the word means change, renew. That, of course, was in a bad sense. But in Job chapter 14 and verse 14, we have Job putting his trust in God. And then we start to see a positive aspect of renew or change. Job chapter 14 and verse 14 says, "If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come." The change from mortality to immortality. And Paul then picks it up in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." What a glorious hope is here in this verse in Isaiah chapter 40. They that wait upon Yahweh shall renew their strength. They'll be changed in strength. God is able to deliver. One of the punishments to Cain was that the earth would not yield its strength. But here God is going to give the strength to those that put their trust in him. It says, "They shall mount up with wings as eagles." Mount up with wings. In Genesis 2 it talks about the mist that went up. It's the same word there. It's the same word as in Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 1. It's interesting to me because there are three words that are used in the records of Jesus' temptations in the Gospels, and Matthew is the one that uses the word from the Septuagint corresponding to Deuteronomy 34 and verse 1. And Moses went up. He went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And Yahweh showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, all Naphtali, all the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, unto Zoar. And Yahweh said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham. He showed Moses all the kingdoms of the cosmos. And it's Matthew that says he was led up, which is the same words in the Hebrew, in the Septuagint for went up in this chapter 34. It's Matthew that emphasises that particular temptation. It says he went into an exceeding high mountain and saw all the kingdoms of the cosmos. And it seems that the recollection would be there for the Lord of Moses, knowing that he couldn't have it then. Just think how that would help the master in his temptation. Moses wasn't able to have it then, but having been faithful, he would attain to it in the time when the dead are raised and the faithful are given immortality. And so, continuing on then, in this lovely last verse, it says, They shall mount up with wings as eagles. You can, I bear you on eagle's wings. We're told in Exodus 19 and verse 4. God brought them on eagle's wings out of Egypt. His care for them was as of an adult eagle, teaching an eaglet to fly in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 11. He talks about Saul and Jonathan as being like eagles. And Proverbs 30 and verses 18 and 19 says, there are things that are too wonderful for me. And one of those is the way of the eagle in the air. And in Ezekiel chapter 1, one of the faces of the cherubim is the face of an eagle. What glorious associations there are with the eagle for those that put their trust in God. And so the blessing continues. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. They shall run. And one of the characteristics of this word run goes through the chapters in Genesis. Genesis 18 verse 2, Abram ran to meet these three that came to him. There's running all over the place. Chapter 24, Abram's servant runs. Rebecca runs. And it seems that the faithful are always running. They're getting a move on. It makes perhaps some of our service, puts it to shame perhaps. Something that's worth a consideration, I think. I know I'm as guilty as any. But they shall run and not be weary. 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 10. He arose and smote the Philistines till his hand was weary, and his hand clave to the sword. And Yahweh wrought a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to spoil. So you've got a description of one of David's great men. But his hand stuck, he couldn't let the sword go because it was stuck. It had been there so long. His hand was weary. But in our exertions, brothers and sisters, if we're accounted worthy, we shall not be weary. We shall walk and not faint. What a contrast with the greatness of our God is puny man. And so God is able to sustain. And that last verse shows how great that ability is. And so in this chapter, Isaiah lives up to his name. His name means Yah is salvation. Yeshayahu is the sort of the Hebrew pronunciation. Yah is salvation. He is the one who is able to save. Let us see that we don't allow ourselves to be led astray by putting our trust in any other power, but let us put our trust in God and be obedient to him, so that we can attain to those glories of the kingdom that is soon to be established upon the earth.